Welcome to Music Fundamentals lecture on musical form and writing a song. I'm Dr. Julietta Rabins, and this is based on the textbook A Creative Approach to Music Fundamentals by William Duckworth. Harmonizing a melody. The first step is to become familiar with your melody. And you can start doing that, just play through it, get used to how it sounds, and you can identify what key it is in. Let's take an example of a melody. And that was Ode to Joy from Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. To identify what key it's in, you can notice what notes tend to be emphasized, what is the pitch that ends most of the phrases, what ends the entire piece of the entire melody. So this one ended on C. You can also just take a kind of an inventory of what are all the notes that are used. In this case, they're all naturals, so there's no indication there's any sharps or flats in the key signature. But you can keep track of what are all the notes used, and you can also notice which pitches are emphasized. Another thing that can help you identify what your tonic note is the presence of a leading tone. So if there was a melody that goes, that motion, that half-step motion up, gives you a nice indication of what the tonic is. Probably that's the leading tone going to the tonic, especially if you see that at important points, like at the end of a phrase of the melody or something like that. Another thing is to stop and identify the melodic phrases that make up your melody. So we want to determine where the cadences occur, where the resting points are in the melody. So if we were to look at this Beethoven example, a little bit of a resting point there, and then the pattern starts again, so that's the end of the first phrase. And that's the end of the second phrase. It's also helpful to remember that phrase lengths tend to be regular. Within a piece of music, you don't typically have a phrase that's 3 measures, then one that's 7, and then one that's 14, and then one that's 2. Typically, they're 4 measures long. You can have some variation from that, but 4 measures is far and away the most common length for a phrase in melody at moderate tempo. And that is because that is about the length of time that a person can sing with one breath. That's about the lung capacity of a human if you're playing a flute or a trumpet. That 4 measures at a moderate tempo is what you can sustain, and then at the cadence, at the end of the phrase, you take your breath. You can also watch for repetitions in the patterns, since these can indicate the start or repetition of a phrase. So this is a good example for noticing patterns, because this example, we start on the E, going up and then down by a step, and then you notice that pattern starts again here. That helps us to identify that there are 2 phrases. So, harmonizing a melody. That's our next topic. If we wanted to add chords to a melody, what do? We want to identify key points at the beginning and ends of phrases where you could find the tonic chord. So you can start by saying, oh, well, where could I add the tonic chord? So for instance here, well, an E is a member of the tonic chord. One thing to always watch for, whatever note is prominent in the melody, the notes that occur on the downbeat, the notes that have longer rhythmic durations. If you find a chord that also contains that note, they're going to match. It's going to harmonize nicely. So for instance here, a tonic chord could go there. It could go here. For the next phrase, we could put one here. one here, and one here. So there's a few spots at the beginning, sometimes the middle, sometimes the ends of phrases. You could put that tonic chord. Then select the harmonic cadences to coincide with the ends of the phrases. If you remember in the last chapter we talked about authentic cadences, which go from 5 to 1, so in the key of C, 5, 1. Plagal cadences go from 4 to 1, so the plagal and authentic cadence work well for phrases that end on the tonic. Then if you have a phrase that does not end on the tonic, we can have that half cadence, so in the key of C, ending on the 5 chord. Or we could have a deceptive cadence in the key of C, ending on the 6th chord. And as you're planning out your melody harmonization, remember that the final cadence will most likely end on tonic. It will most likely be an authentic cadence, could be a plagal. And that is true in this case. The second phrase, let me play the ending. Then see, we could do the 5 chord to the 1 chord. So that's an authentic cadence. Sometimes phrases are paired as a question and answer phrase. This occurs when the first ends on a half cadence and the second ends on an authentic cadence. So if the first phrase ends on the 5 chord and the second phrase ends on the tonic chord, the 1 chord, you have a pair of question and answer phrases. The principle being the first does not end on tonic, so it sounds unresolved like a question, and the second phrase ends on tonic, sounding resolved like an answer. So we do have that here. I'll just play the chords at the cadence. Half cadence. Authentic cadence. So that's a pair of question and answer phrases. Now, as we continue to harmonize a melody, you want to have the primary melodic notes, the notes that fall on strong beats or have longer rhythmic durations, match the note in the chord you choose to place beneath it. And so, for instance, this first measure, well, those are all steps, right? So what kind of chord might you pick? Well, the downbeat is the E. It's repeated, so E is emphasized. Yes, we do hear an F, but we also hear a G. So of that first measure, we have 2 notes that match a tonic chord. So that's probably going to work. And then the next measure, the downbeat is a G, so that's important to realize. And then we also have a D. Those are both in the dominant chord. Or if you wanted to think of a 5-7 chord, we actually have 3 notes in that chord, in that measure. The next measure, C is emphasized, it's on the downbeat and played twice. This is step motion, but then we also have an E. Looks like we could go back to the tonic. The next measure, so we have an E. We could put that with a C chord, or it could be what we call a non-harmonic tone. D is definitely emphasized there. It's played twice and it has a longer rhythmic value. Probably going to work well with the 5 chord, but it's one of the notes in the 5 chord. So you can continue on like that, look at each measure, and take a little inventory of the melody notes and decide which ones are emphasized. You will most often have chords, have notes in a measure that fall outside of a chord, just like our first measure. That stepwise motion, well, you're not going to have all those 3 in a triad. So what you're doing is you're looking for what notes seem most important. What's on the downbeat, what's repeated, what has longer rhythmic durations. So another thing you can think about is the harmonic rhythm. That is the regular rate of change for the chords. This is often once per measure, but it can also occur twice in a measure or in any other possible pattern depending on the nature of the melody. Harmonic rhythm could be very slow. You could have one chord for an entire phrase. We could have one chord for 4 measures. You could have a chord changing every 2 measures. For our purposes, the best way to go about this is you can put one chord for each measure, and most of the time it's going to change to a different chord for each measure. So just use, if it's in 4/4 time, you can just put in a chord with whole notes. If you're in 3/4 time, just put a chord in, filling the measure with a dotted half note. So for this example, let's do one chord per measure. You can also think about chord progression when you're harmonizing a melody. You can, like the first steps I've said, you just kind of isolate each measure, take an inventory of the melody notes, and then just find some kind of chord that's going to fit with it. But we can also think, well, how should chords follow each other? So many melodies can be harmonized using only the 1 chord, the 4 chord, and the 5 chord. And so that's another thing. If you're trying to decide, well, which chord should I use? I have a couple options. You can always say to yourself, well, if it fits the 1-4-5 pattern, 1 chord, 4 chord, 5 chord, 1, it will also tend to make sense. So the harmony has certain patterns that make sense in their own right. And so if it looks like it could work with your melody, that's something that can help you make a decision about which chord to use. Also, descending 5th and descending 3rd chord patterns, or any combination, those tend to be pretty successful because each chord is connected to its adjacent chord by at least 1 note. So that usually gives it a smooth transition. So if you were doing another melody, let's see, just we could do something just that. You could harmonize that. See, and then the next one. We could also harmonize it. You could also do A here. So you do have a lot of choices. Okay, let's talk a little about musical form. This is how music unfolds over time. It is the overall pattern or structure of the piece. This is also, we defined the large sections in a piece and how those are arranged. There are 3 principles at work in constructing form. One is repetition, which provides balance and symmetry. There's also variation, which connects new ideas to those already stated. And there's contrast, which provides surprise and potentially drama. So in our first example, we're going to use repetition to start the next phrase, but with a little bit of variation. And then the next section, which we haven't played for you yet, actually uses contrast. And then we go back to repetition. The first kind of form that we're going to look at is strophic form. It's pretty straightforward. A strophe is like a verse. It focuses on the principle of repetition and variation. There's not a lot of contrast in strophic form. Hymns and many folk songs use this repetition of musical material with new text on each verse. So if any of you have sung hymns or different folk songs where you sing the same melody over and over with new text, that's an example of strophic form. While strophic form can involve literal repetition, there is often some degree of variation. That's a little bit of alteration to the original statement with each repetition. The 12-bar blues is one example, since the 12 measures repeat continuously as the song unfolds. So with the 12-bar blues, you were introduced to that already, but you were only introduced to like one verse of it, where you have so 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we go up to the second verse, so that would be one strophe, one verse, and then repeating through the whole pattern with just, little bits of variation here and there, but in principle, that same set of 12 bars can go over and over and over again. And then in that way, it's strophic form. Let's take a look at binary form. This is a two-part form based on the principle of contrast. Often each section is repeated. Sections are labeled A and B. So I'm giving you an example of St. Basil's hymn. And this is the melody for the A section. And then we have a B section. So you can see the first half that starts with a repetition on E moving down to A is quite different from the B section. So here's the A section again. Now here's the B section. So binary form can occur on different scales. Like you can have a really short, that's actually a pretty short example of binary form because there's only a total of 4 phrases. But you can have really large scale forms where the A section takes 5 minutes and then the B section takes 5 minutes. Or you can have one where the A section is 30 seconds, B section is 30 seconds, like what I just did. Typically, the sections will be of similar length. Like it doesn't make sense to have an A section that's 5 minutes and a B section that's 30 or 30 seconds. We wouldn't typically label those as equivalent events in a musical form. So there is a sense of balance and symmetry when we're identifying sections and phrases and that kind of thing. Just like we said with melodic phrases, they typically are 4 measures each. So here's an example of a short little ternary form, little 3-part form. Here's an A phrase. And now the B phrase. Then we restate A. that entire section with ABA like that could be labeled as a big A section, and then you have an entire next section that's just as long that is contrasting, and we call B. Here's another example of ternary form. We have Over the Rainbow, A section. And this is our little half cadence, you could call it. And then definitely a cadence on the tonic. So you have a little feeling of question and answer. There's a few different chords you could use with that half cadence, but it ends on the G. It's not ending melodically on tonic. So that's our A section. In this case has two phrases, a little question and answer. And now our B section is very contrasting. Very different rhythm and everything. And so now we're back. We're going to restate A. And see the first phrase ends on G, a little bit up in the air. And now the last phrase of A ends nicely on tonic. So ternary form, three-part form, it's very rare that you have an A section, a B section, and then a C section. It's typically going to be A, B, A. And then we actually have a form that's somewhere in between binary and ternary. It's actually a two-part form, but the B section starts as a contrast and then kind of rounds itself off by restating A. So here's a beautiful little example by Mozart. We have A, this is our A section. There's a half cadence, very much on G, on our dominant, still A section. So we have a pair of question and answer phrases. Now let's see what happens. B section, it changes. Half cadence on the end of the first phrase. And now look, in our second section, we're going to hear this again. So the A section consisted of two phrases, a question and an answer phrase, and the B section consisted of a question and an answer phrase. In the A section, the question and answer phrase had similar material. The B section, our first phrase was contrasting, it was something completely new, and our answer phrase restated material from the A section. That is what we call a rounded binary form. I have one more form to mention to you. It's called 32-bar song form. This form explores the principle of contrast and repetition. It is an AABA form. So we have, it's actually pretty similar to rounded binary. It's actually very much like what we just did. You have a first phrase that's like A, and then you restate that phrase. Then you do something contrasting, and then back to A again. That's the first phrase, ends on half cadence. contrasting phrase, and then back to A again. So that's a variation of Old Folks at Home. It's varied a little bit there, but it shows you the principle. Also, the Mozart example shows you that one phrase of A, a very similar phrase, A again, a contrasting phrase, back to A. That's 32-bar standard song form. Well, thank you for joining me for this lecture, and please let me know if you have any questions.